Hi, this time I wanted to recommend to you 5 horror role playing games where the player characters are the monsters. And I also wanted to give you some tips, advice, some considerations that I've gathered throughout the years when it comes to running a game that contains a party of adventurers with both living and unliving or undead player characters. Now let's talk about those recommendations. My first recommendation is Bloodshadows. This is published by Presses Intermedia, the same ones that published Ghost Stories. So the system is somewhat similar. The main difference is that Bloodshadows, you roll two six-sided dice, you add a couple of modifiers, and you try to reach or beat a target number, a difficulty number. But when it comes to ghost stories, like I mentioned in my previous video, in that game you add skill plus attribute, and you need to roll below that total. If you didn't see my video of the 5 horror investigation or paranormal investigation role-playing game recommendations, the link will be in the description below. I recommend that you check it out. Blood Shadows allows you to play as not only humans but many other sorts of creatures, undead and monstrous creatures. So for example, you have some pretty standard things like ghouls and vampires, werewolves, but you also have some very unusual things. For example, the Catrarms, which are basically humans with 4 arms. You also have the Elkists, if I remember the name correctly. They are the offspring of ghouls and an extinct species of demons. So that's how that species, undead sort of creature was created. And they actually have this very strange ability of making it so that a part of their body, a limb for example, faces in and out. So they are quite skilled or quite deadly in combat. Imagine if you're trying to hit them and you're trying to hit their arm or their head, and they just face out that part so that your attack misses. Or maybe you are in a brawl and they are attacking you, and you kind of like want to block or perhaps even parry their attacks, but they face out their arm, so now their attack goes through and it hits. You also have some things like the Humbi, which are the offspring of humans and succubi or incubi. They have the ability to teleport. You also have some things like the Grease, that they are basically kind of like Clayface from Batman. They are made of this strange malleable clay-like substance, and they can reshape their bodies. There are also some things, I don't remember the names of these ones, but they are basically very strong humanoids that exist by, and monsters of course, that exist by eating trash or garbage, that is food that has rotted away. So there are a lot of interesting species to play in that role-playing game, but I also really love the setting. It's a noir, a fantasy horror noir sort of experience. You have the security of the cities. You have many opportunities to carry out some detective work, things related to corruption and criminals, but you also have the outside of the cities. Outside of the cities is kind of like a badlands sort of situation. There have been many natural and unnatural catastrophes in the world of Blood Shadows, many very severe or cataclysmic wars. So the entire zone outside of the cities is quite devastated and holds many eldritch horrors. It's not so much as a post-apocalypse experience. It's more like going into the eldritch wilderness of the unknown. If you enjoy those stories of Lovecraft, where the characters are going into this area of wilderness with many different ancient sites of the worship of different evil cultists and such, that's the outside of the cities. In fact, the maps are not very reliable. Not many have ventured outside of the cities and have survived outside. And so it's a very exciting setting that you can handle. You can use it to play all sorts of adventures. You could explore some very noir standard things within the cities, but maybe you need to travel from one city to the other, or you want to explore to see if you can find some valuable relics from the past wars. You could venture into the wilderness and face off against many horrifying things, supernatural and natural things, and perhaps some enemies that you created, or that you maybe you got into the wrong side of things in a city and you have an entire faction or organization following you. They could attack you in the wilderness. So a very, very fun horror role-playing game if you want to play as monstrous characters. Oh, by the way, the Elkists, the offspring of ghouls and that ancient species of demon, they need to eat the organs of humans or catrarms to survive. So I think this ties a bit with what I'm going to talk about later in the video. Now let's go to my next recommendation, and it's the Ghost Hack. This is based on the Black Hack system. Many of you probably know about it, but for those that do not, it's basically Dungeons and Dragons in an extremely simplified or streamlined form. It's old school D&D, but taking a lot of the bookkeeping out, the resolution of many things. It's quite simple to handle. So with Ghost Hack, you play as ghosts, humans that have died. There are different types of ghosts. You have poltergeists, banshees, nightmanes, if I remember correctly. Which one was the other? Nightmanes, poltergeists, banshees. There's another one that I'm forgetting. There's also an expansion that even adds more ghost types. And you have standard powers associated with those different ghost types, like the Banshee. You basically can wail very powerfully and cause all sorts of effects. The Poltergeist can move objects around. The adventures have a lot to do with surviving in the afterlife, but also protecting those attachments. They are called mortal coils in the game, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe your ghost has a loved one that was left behind, or maybe they are fond of a particular place or object. So you are trying to protect those mortal coils or attachments of your ghost from all sorts of supernatural and natural dangers. Sometimes your ghosts can get into quite a lot of trouble. It's very easy for you to die, but your ghost could end up turning into this sort of revengeful spirit, or a wight of sorts, and you start to cause damage to the other members of the party or to your loved ones that are still alive. And other times you can even be sucked into Hades, into a very dark place, dark plane, and you can even run the danger of wandering Hades for eternity. So you can lose your character. You could become a bad guy, a non-player character that turned into an evil wraith sort of being, or you can end up lost in Hades. So I highly recommend that role-playing game. My next recommendation is, oh, by the way, if you haven't seen my review of Bloodshadows, I'm going to put the link to my complete review in the description below. You will get a lot more details about everything there. Now, my other recommendation is the Dawnline. I'm also going to put a link containing my entire playlist of all of the reviews that I did for the Dawnline. The Dawnline is perfect for those of you that like anime horror. It's basically almost like Vampire Hunter the game, the role-playing game. You play as these vampires of very different types. If you are somewhat tired of vampires that look too much the same, these vampires are very different from each other. You have a vampire that is basically like a hulking monster of sorts, kind of like a huge monster. You also have a vampire that looks kind of like a chimera with many different supernatural parts attached to his or her body. You also have a vampire that is very beautiful, kind of like Vampire Hunter D. So there are many different types of vampires. They all have their powers and weaknesses, you could say. And in the setting, you are playing as this group of vampires that are protecting a mortal caravan. It's a moving town. It's a constant race for survival because darkness and light, they have a very deadly effect on the setting. On the one hand, you have the Dawnline this light that is constantly moving across the planet, and if you end up in the light, you will probably end up dead. Everyone that goes into the light simply is unheard of again. They disappear. They do not know what happens to them. There are rumors that some have survived, but it's still something that you do not want to risk, not going into the light. But if you go into the darkness, there are also many horrifying creatures there. So you have to stay in a sort of twilight state all the time. That's why all of the towns and cities in the Dawnline, they're constantly moving with wagons and vehicles all across the planet. So vampires protect humans in a sort of symbiotic relationship, as they also obtain companionship and protection on the side of humans. Of course, vampires cannot be on guard all the time, so they benefit from the relationship. Both of the species protect each other. But of course, there are evil vampires and humans as well. So it's a setting with a sort of post-apocalypse, alien, Wild West feel to it. Really, really awesome setting. Please check out my reviews of the Dawnline. The next recommendation, it's not a role-playing game exactly. It's a setting for Savage Worlds specifically. And this is Accursed. Accursed is not an easy setting to get into if you're not already into Savage Worlds, because to play it you need the core rulebook. The recent edition of Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, if I'm not mistaken, has already received an update to play Accursed. I'm going to put the link in the description below to all of the things that I mentioned, but here I'm also going to put the link to the Savage Worlds update, so you can run Accursed with the newest edition. But you also need the Savage Worlds Horror Companion. So it's not exactly the most affordable setting to get into, but I think it's worth it. With Accursed, you have a world that reminds you a bit of Ravenloft. That is, you have these different regions under the threat of very powerful beings. It's basically a coven of evil witches. They're kind of like hags, although there is a specific hag in that group. So these witches, they take humans and they change their shape and their mind. They deform them according to their different abilities. So one witch can take a human and turn him into a sort of mummy. Another one can take a human and transform that human into a sort of golem. You could end up transformed into a sort of lycanthropy in the case of the Vargr. You also can be changed into a vampire or half vampire. So, and the player characters participate as these humans that were transformed, but their will was strong enough to break free from the control of the witches, and they now fight against these evil spellcasters. I think that the main difference between the Ravenloft or a similar setting with Accursed is that Accursed feels quite heroic. All the characters are very powerful. They have some very creative uses for their abilities. There are some expected things, like for example the Revenant type of player character. You are very difficult to kill, but you also have, like the Golem character, you can basically take apart your body. You just pull off your arm or your leg or whatever, and you can reattach it later on. So this is quite useful if, for example, maybe there is something that you need to activate on the other side of some sort of a grate or some metal bars, or there is a small orifice and you cannot fit in there. You could pull off your hand or your arm, and you could try to control your, kind of like the Addams Family, the hand that moves. You could start moving your limb towards the switch that you need to activate, or the button. There are some other characters, like, I don't remember if it's a wraith or a ghost, but you can obviously move through solid objects. You also have some more standard powers, like I mentioned, in the case of the vampire, that you can enhance your physical attributes by drinking blood. The lycanthropy, that is quite devastating in physical combat specifically. You also have like a snake sort of creature, the Ophidians, if I'm not mistaken, that have a poisonous bite. So if you want to play heroic, monstrous player characters, it's a great setting for that. And there's a lot of variety to the types of zones and cultures that you can experience. Some areas in that setting, they feel a bit like in Egypt. ancient Egypt, evil pharaoh sort of adventures. You also have some places that feel like the Russian wilderness, or even some areas that remind you of Transylvania. So there are a lot of different places that you can explore, and there the setting is quite well supported. I think it's worth it if you want to explore a specific region. Look for that expansion, because they add a lot more thematically and mechanically speaking. Now let's talk about something else. This is somewhat of composite recommendation, and it's just that when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, there are so many expansions and supplements out there that allow you to play as monstrous or undead characters. I'm going to give 4 recommendations. My first recommendation is if you play Labyrinth Lord, and this is not specifically Dungeons and Dragons, but anything that is a retro clone or pseudo clone of the system. When it comes to Labyrinth Lord, we have this supplement. The name is Blood and Bone. Last time I checked, several months back, I think it was either free or pay what you want. So please check it out. Maybe it's already still available like that. So with Blood and Bone, you have this set of rules that allows you to play as skeletons, vampires, mummies, and there's something quite good about this supplement. Compared to other undead supplements, I think it's one of the most balanced, because you need more experience points to level up if you are a very powerful undead. There, you feel like there's more balance, really, especially when you compare it to another thing that I'm going to mention in a few moments. You also have rules that give you advice on how to run undead campaigns. Like, for example, you could create a group with a necromancer with his undead bodies, not necessarily minions, but perhaps some allies that he obtained while moving through different tombs, graveyards, crypts, mausoleums, and necropolis, perhaps. Lots of good advice when it comes to running a campaign with an undead party. I think that even though some undead creatures normally seem more powerful than others, there is still great balance, like I told you, because, for example, you have the zombie and the Juju zombie. Normally you would expect the Juju zombie to be a bit more powerful than the normal zombie, but they actually each have their own role. Although there is difference in the experience points that you need to gather before leveling up. The Juju zombie feels a bit more specialized to fulfill a rogue type of role within the party. The Juju zombie is more agile, quite skilled at climbing, but not as sturdy as the normal zombie. In fact, the normal zombie, if that character has access to a corpse, you can basically regenerate hit points by taking pieces of that corpse and attaching them to your body. It feels a lot like a different sort of fighter. However, they do not give you specific details as to how much time you need to take pieces from that body to replace your damaged body parts. So I expect there are a lot more rules. I don't remember all of them, but I expect that there are more cases in which some details have been omitted, so you will have to house rules some things or homebrew some things, in my opinion, some details. But like I told you, it feels really balanced, and especially if you compare it with living player characters. I never felt like the zombie completely outclassed the human fighter. Now, my other recommendation, and this one is a bit more, I don't think it's as polished, and it's basically the Grim Harvest Requiem module for Ravenloft. In that box set, although it's going to be very difficult to get it as the box set, perhaps it's going to be quite expensive, you can get it as a complete PDF. So that's great. In fact, I always wanted to get that as a physical product. It's one of the campaigns that I never got to finish or complete in my teenage years. My Ravenloft group fell apart during that time, and we were just about to go into Requiem Grim Harvest, and because I wasn't sure when I was going to be able to run that part of the campaign. I never got the box set, and when I actually had the money and the intentions of running it, I couldn't find the box set anywhere, and it was only many years after when I actually got it as a PDF. And so when it comes to the ways that you can run an undead party with Requiem, you do have so many different undead types of beings like shadows, specters, leaks, wights, ghosts, vampires. But I think the balance is not. They are not as balanced when compared to the Labyrinth Lord book that I told you about a few minutes ago. Some of the undead are simply too powerful. You do have those attribute requirements. That is, if you want to play as a lich or a vampire, you need some really high attributes for that. You need like 18 intelligence in the case of the lich, and the vampire also needed something around 18 or so. But when compared to skeletons, the lich and the vampire is just so superior because of the powers and the apparent immortality. You know that vampires, when they are in danger of dying, they become this sort of like wraith, mist-like form, and they start to escape. Or the lich, as long as you have the phylactery of the lich in a safe space, perhaps in hidden in some dungeon or something, it's very difficult for your character to die. So it's not as balanced, in my opinion, like I said, when compared to Blood and Bone, but it's still quite fun in my opinion. And I eventually want to finish that campaign with Abraham's Method. That is the entire trilogy of Requiem. So those are my. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, of course. And if you are into, excuse me for a moment. Here they are. If you are into Dungeons and Dragons 3.0, 3.5, or Pathfinder, I highly recommend that you get Libris Mortis, the Book of Undead. Let me see if I can get that into a bit more focus. So yeah, Libris Mortis and Heroes of Horror. Heroes of Horror. Yeah, so with Libris Mortis, you have rules to create all sorts of undead. I don't think they are balanced, but then again, in Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, there is no balance. All of the recent character classes and creatures, they are just sometimes they are just too powerful, sometimes they are underwhelming. So you just play them with the intention of having fun. So you have some very interesting character classes like the Pale Master. You're basically a spellcaster, and you, because of the grafts that you are applying, you start to become a bit quite like the undead. Now I'm looking for the rules. I don't know if it's in this one or Heroes of Horror, but there are some undead. Here they are. Undead monster classes. You ever wanted to play as a morgue or a mummy or a ghoul? You have all the rules here. The only thing that I didn't like of these character classes, monstrous character classes or undead classes, is that the vampire is not a complete vampire. It's basically a vampire spawn. So you felt a bit weaker when compared to a fully fledged vampire. Although there are just so many when it comes to undead material, in having an undead player character in Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, Pathfinder. I'm going to put a link in the description to a vampire class for Pathfinder. I'll see if I can find it. That it's quite powerful. It's sort of like a vampire revenant. But still, Libris Mortis, if you ever wanted rules and you didn't have a lot of supplements, you don't have a lot of supplements covering all of the different undead types or creatures, Libris Mortis probably has something that you can use. And when it comes to Heroes of Horror, although you do have a lot of tips for horror adventures, there are also some rules that can apply to monstrous player characters. Like, for example, let me see if I can find this character. It's basically like a demonic, half demon sort of character. I don't see if... here it is. It's a prestige class, apparently. Well, this one is also pretty good. This is a complete class. This is the Dread Necromancer. This is if you want to play as a necromancer character that is actually quite decent in close quarters combat, and when you reach the highest level, you become a lich. So if you want to play like from human to lich sort of class and not start out as a lich right away, this is a really good class for that, to create that sort of story. It also depends. You also have this class, which is the Corrupt Avenger. In this book, you have a system of corruption. You start gaining these things called taint, and it reminds me a bit of the Ravenloft powers check. A lot of people do not like this mechanic because it's a bit more cumbersome in terms of keeping track of it and bookkeeping, but you start to become quite monstrous because of the taint, depending on the different tainted areas that you explore. In fact, the Castle Ravenloft module for 3.5, there's an entire section dedicated to telling you how to use the taint mechanic. What I didn't like of the taint is that a lot of the abilities that you get with the taint, it's a sort of downward spiral into a tainted madness, to put it in a way. So your character could become the villain, but in the meantime you get some advantages, but those advantages affect living creatures. So it's a bit disappointing that if you're playing a horror adventure, you're probably going to fight against all sorts of undead, and as your character becomes tainted, your abilities are only mostly useful against living creatures. So mechanically speaking, it doesn't make too much sense. Thematically speaking, it does make sense because basically it displays how the taint is turning you against living creatures. But you can also play as a Dread Witch that specializes in using fear-based effects. There was another one. Here it is, the Fiend Blooded. If you wanted to play as a human with a demonic or fiendish blood, this is a good prestige class for that. Maybe you become Fiend Blooded along the way, or you always had that in your blood, in a Lovecraftian sort of style. You also have the Tainted Scholar. If you want to play like a sort of occultist that start to become more and more corrupted with the adventures and the situations you face, this is a good prestige class. So those are my horror recommendations when it comes to having a role-playing game where the party is composed or made out of monstrous player characters or undead player characters, or something in between. You could have humans and monsters and undead, humans and monsters and undead in the same group. So now I want to give some tips or considerations about that, because I remember when I was not very experienced in role-playing games, when I tried to have parties of adventurers that had humans and monsters and undead, but particularly undead, it was somewhat challenging because undead and the living, even if they are elves, dwarves, humans, all of those different species and races, they feel a certain bond in that they need to breathe, they need to eat and sleep and reproduce. But when compared to the undead almost feel like completely antagonistic. Most of the undead feed on living creatures in one way or the other. So how can you do that? How can you have a party of adventurers with humans and undead working towards the same objective or goal in a certain harmony without killing each other? So you need to look for those points in common between humans and or living creatures and undead, because it's not just humans. Of course, you could have minotaurs, like I said, gnomes and halflings, and they are still alive, so they feel a bit more on the same side, rather when compared to the undead, which are on the on a more ravenous or otherworldly side of the spectrum. I think that's something that both living and unliving or undead creatures have in common, is that they still need to feed, they need to eat. but the difference in diet is quite noticeable. Many undead need to feed on the blood of the living, or they need to eat their flesh or their organs. Some of them feed on certain negative emotions, so you need to find some way to satisfy the appetite of the undead. It's somewhat easy for the living to keep on going with their business without killing the other members of the party. Even in the case of, for example, if you have a minotaur traveling with you, as long as you have some meat that minotaur can eat, they are not going to kill the members of the party. But because the living members of the party can serve as sustenance for the undead, they need to find something else. If you have an undead with you that needs to eat the flesh and organs of living creatures, you constantly need to take on missions and quests that involve killing something that is alive. Perhaps some corrupt government officials, or bandits, all sorts of living enemies, so that you can take the corpses of your enemies and give them to the undead members of the party so that they can sustain themselves, obtain that nourishment. In the case of some creatures like vampires, it's a bit more simple because sometimes they just need a little blood. So even the party could be like donating a bit of their blood. Each living member of the party could be giving some of their blood to the vampire member. Or like I said, they could take on missions where they need to fight against some living opponents, and they can let the vampire rejoice and indulge himself drinking the blood of their enemies. In the case of some ghostly enemies that perhaps they feed on conflict or something like that, maybe you can have a group of living mercenaries that are going from conflict, from war to war, to skirmish to skirmish, and the ghostly being is feeding upon all of those different conflictive situations. But that also means that when there is peace, that undead ally will probably become an enemy. So you need to take that into consideration. That's what connects a bit with the objectives or a higher purpose in the campaign. For example, maybe the undead creature, maybe, of course, one time it was alive, and this creature was loyal to a certain kingdom or followed the teachings of a particular deity, and the living members of the party also pledged some oath, or are loyal to a kingdom or to a king, or they follow the same teachings of the same deity. So the undead work together with the other members of the party in order to fulfill some objective, some purpose. So maybe when they actually reach the end of the campaign and they manage to defeat their major enemies or antagonists, or they manage to rescue or recover something, maybe the undead can now move to the next step in the afterlife. Maybe his or her deity welcomes them into a sort of paradise. There could be different interpretations, or maybe they reincarnate as humans or something else. So that's a good way of closing the campaign before the undead ally becomes an enemy, because like I said, maybe there is no more source of nourishment for that entity, and now it turns against the player characters. But that also could also be a way to start another campaign. Maybe now the undead player characters become the new enemies in this new campaign, where you need to create new player characters because the other player characters, maybe they end up dying or retiring, or they are too weak for some reason or the other to fight against this new threat. Another thing to take into consideration is that a lot of undead still find some way to reproduce themselves, and not necessarily in a sexual way, because there are many undead that when they kill a living creature, that living creature becomes an undead of the same type, and sometimes under the control of that original undead progenitor. So you need to keep in mind that if an undead member of the party suddenly starts to create a lot of vampire spawn or wraith-like beings under his or her command, it's going to be quite suspicious. The other members of the party, the living members, they're going to feel worried that perhaps this undead fiend is amassing an army to attack the living. So there should be a strict control over that. Maybe, let's say, you have a ghoul or a ghast sort of character, and it starts to create ghouls or ghasts, they should limit the number of ghouls or ghasts that they create to perhaps just one or two, just to be on the safe side. Another good element to introduce to that campaign is the possibility of the undead eventually attaining some sort of state of enlightenment, like in Vampire the Masquerade. I always forget the name of this path of enlightenment. I think it was Golconda. I think it was Golconda. I don't know why, but I always forget the name. Golconda. I think it's Golconda. So maybe there is a state for the undead creature that can reach that enlightenment where the undead does not need any sort of flesh or blood or negative energy to feed upon to keep sustaining himself or herself, and they can just exist as an undead being, just supported or existing because of willpower. So that's great. Maybe it's a good way to reward when a player character reaches a higher level. Maybe you reached level 10 or 15 in a D20 based system, and now that undead no longer needs to drain the blood of others or eat the flesh of others, etc., and you're just there fulfilling a purpose. You should also consider the personal objective or purpose of the undead members of the party, because even though they are undead, they are probably still fond of many things that the living also like gathering treasure. Maybe they like art. Maybe they like to collect sculptures and paintings. Maybe they like music. Maybe, for example, if you are playing as a mummy type of character, a lot of those mummies were buried with their belongings, their treasures, their weapons, and maybe they want to collect new weapons and new pieces of art. They like to decorate their tombs. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, in the accursed setting, you have these mummy types of characters, that player characters, and they can use their sarcophagus to create a sort of armor around them. So that's pretty cool. And they can even take a feat or an ability that can allow them to modify the sarcophagus to become a sort of multi-tool. So that's pretty, it's a bit absurd, but awesome at the same time. So yes, I hope you can use these considerations when you have a party of living and unliving or undead player characters, so that they don't kill each other, that they work towards a certain goal. Find a way to manage that reconciliation between their sustenance, what they want to eat, the things that they want to accomplish. And like I said, maybe they can reach a certain state in which the undead no longer needs to be a threat for the living. They become some sort of like benign spirit of sorts. It depends on the type of undead as well. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope you find the recommendations and the tips useful. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru-RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.